Hello and welcome to LocalLink Hub's podcast, a show with local impact for global change. For our new listeners, LocalLink Hub is the localization and partnership initiative for Terre des Hommes. This global online platform provides free e-learning and capacity development resources for local and national actors. Our project is funded by the Somaha Foundation. I'm Anike Vosch and I'm the Communication and Content Manager for LocalLink Hub, and thank you for listening to today's episode with the title Beyond the Master-Servant Dynamic, Degan Ali on Localization and Decolonization. Let's get started. Our host today is my colleague Martin Ali. He is the Localization and Partnership Manager at Terre des Hommes, and he will be talking with Degan Ali, an internationally famous humanitarian leader. Degan Ali is the Executive Director of Adesso, an African-based organization and co-founder of Near Network. Our guest implemented Somalia's first large-scale cash transfer program in 2003 and advocates for shifting more funding to local organizations in the Global South. Her work has influenced major policy changes, including the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit's commitment to direct 25% of funds to local actors. She was recognized as one of the most influential African women in 2023 and the Nonprofit Leader of Year in 2024. In today's episode, we will be talking about how a genuinely equitable partnership looks like in the aid sector, what are the biggest barriers preventing Global South organizations from having equal decision-making power in aid initiatives, and what are the practical steps UN agencies, international NGOs, or institutional donors can take to dismantle power imbalances in their partnerships with local NGOs. You can also learn why it would seem odd to expect everyone to speak Swahili if a Kenyan organization were to assist in flood-hit Spain.
Hello, Degan Ali. Welcome to LocalLink Hub's podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you today to discuss such an important topic for the sector.
Thank you for having me, Martin.
The first question that we have for you is our interest in what drew you to the localization and the decolonization movement in the aid sector. What was the interest for you?
Honestly, I think having been raised in the US, I was born in Somalia and I went to the US as a young child and I experienced a lot of, I would say probably racism. And so I could recognize it. I have the tools and the understanding and the analytics and all of that to analyze it and understand it and see it. Whereas a lot of my Global South colleagues probably don't know how to verbalize and understand these kinds of incidents. I think that was one. And then second, I think, having worked with the UN and being treated with, first of all, the challenges I had in even getting a UN job. That was my first experience with just how difficult and kind of, nepotistic and a bit racist the system was. In the salary scales, I was told that I'm a national because even though I have a US passport, US education, I was told you're going to be treated like a national. You never get an expat international salary. And then once I finally did get a position, I was given, a lot of respect, access to spaces and access to people because I was a UN staffer. And all of that was it goes to your head and you feel a bit arrogant and I would actually complain and I would be like, why am I I would say to my boss as a 28-year-old, why am I meeting a minister or somebody very senior in a government? And I just didn't understand that, honestly. I pushed back on that and then put that against, side by side against the experiences I had now leading or working in a local NGO and seeing how my mother was treated as the founder of Adesso by the international system in her own country, and then how I was later treated, where we were just disrespected, we were questioned, our integrity was constantly questioned, our data was questioned, all of that So it was just a shock to my system to have left the UN and then now come to a place where not only was I earning almost nothing compared to what I was earning at the UN, but I was also treated as if I was nothing and like a second or third class citizen and leading a local NGO. So I think that experience and that vast, very different worlds and departure from two different realities, I think was a shock to my system, honestly. And I think that's what probably radicalized me the most.
I understand. So it really shaped the person you are today. And I'm sure it also shaped the values that you have on when it comes to localization and decolonization. And I was really wondering what you thought were why is it such an urgent and central issue today for the aid sector, for the sector in general, topics of localization and decolonization?
Well, I mean, I think there's two separate answers because I think localization is a term I don't like, but it talks about really more the issue of moving money to local actors and maybe having them in more leadership roles and leadership positions in the space, in the sector, in humanitarian and development space, where I think decolonization is a very political conversation. It's a very political understanding of the root causes of why even we need global north institutions coming to our countries in the south, and why do we even need aid? Why are we in the position where our governments can't meet the basic needs of their citizens and meet the social compact that they have with their citizens? So I think that, and why can't we solve different humanitarian crises around the world? You know, issues like the structure of the UN and all the other Bretton Woods institutions and veto power and financial and economic and trade systems and all of those kinds of things, debt issues, all of that understanding really needs to, for me, is really pivotal in a decolonization conversation. And it can't just be an issue about moving money. And so I think they have separate understanding, separate analysis, and separate kind of actions to solve or rectify or improve or dismantle the system. I think the localization conversation or activities around more locally led action is, I think, a lighter touch, and it's about just kind of fixing the system at the edge, whereas the decolonization conversation is questioning the entire system. And I think, you know, saying, why do even we need aid? How do we get our countries to even need you all? How do we create a system for mutual solidarity where people in Africa, in Ghana or South Africa can become donors to people in the US or UK? So I think the conversation and the response and the actions and the understanding are very different.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going through at Talism, we're going through a lot of questions related to that, and we are trying to, I believe, change the way we work to go towards that direction. We struggle a little bit with something is, and that's where I'm interested to have your opinion on that, is what would represent a genuinely equitable partnership between an international NGO like Terre des Hommes and a local or national NGO from the global south to you? What would need to change for this to be really equitable and realistic in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think various things need to happen. Number one, I think there is a whole internal, deep, honest reflection on the future of Terre des Hommes. Where does it want to be in 10, 15, 20 years? Should it even exist? Will it even be needed? Hoping that these countries in the global south are not as dependent on aid and some of these political issues that I've talked about get resolved. We're seeing things changing dramatically, very fast, and not only the speed of change, but I think the magnitude of the change with what's happening with BRICS and with the Sahel regions, what those three countries in the Sahel regions have been able to accomplish in a very short amount of time, I think to us is a great sign of hope. So I think there has to be a deep conversation. Should Terre des Hommes exist? Should it merge? Should it go out of business? Should it change its entire business model to be something very different? So that's, I think, the first part of a reflection exercise about Terre des Hommes. Then I think the second part is, okay, so we are a humanitarian organization responding to crisis and to support, I guess, children in these countries. how do we do that differently? How do we do that better? And that is, I think, a more, that whole equitable partnership conversation is first and foremost, do you even need an office on the ground? Do you need to be present on the ground? Or should you be having a whole partnership model where you just raise the money, provide some technical support in your countries, let's say in Europe, and the partners are the ones who are designing the programs, who are implementing the programs, and you come and provide technical support, or you embed your staff, one or two staff as needed based on their capacity constraints in the partner. And instead of investing all your money in establishing an office and, I don't know, 50 staff in a country or 100 staff. There are some INGOs that have 400 or 500 staff in a given country. Instead of investing that money in your expatriate staff or national staff who are earning these double or triple what a local partner is earning, should we not be investing that money then in building a long-term investment in your partners so that they grow, they become more resilient, they get access to unrestricted funding, they are developing their back office systems, their capacity, and all of that. And they're stronger partners for you, including holding you accountable and refusing your money if they say, these are our conditions. Like, you want a situation where your partner can hold you accountable. You don't want a situation of master and servant relationship. And right now, that's the kind of relationship that INGOs and UN agencies have with their partners. If we're serious about changing this and really equitable partnerships, then it should be, how do I get these organizations in a given country, my partners, our partners, getting from point A to point Z as quickly as possible so that they can hold us accountable and really sit across from us in the table as equals and say, Terre des Hommes, you're doing this incorrectly, or if you, these are red lines. If you don't change your behavior in this way, I'm sorry, we're not going to work with you. That's the kind of challenge that should be coming from partners. And right now, that doesn't happen because most of the partners are underfunded, under-resourced, scared, and feel very powerless that they can negotiate better terms with their partners, and we have to understand, as partners, you really are donors, and the biggest donors to local NGOs are INGOs and UN agencies. They don't deal with CETA Sweden. They don't deal with the Gates Foundation. They don't deal with all of these different donors that you guys are dealing with. The gatekeepers are you all. And so you really are donors. So if you want to change that donor relationship and act more as real partners, it means there has to be all types of things that have to change. And then the third thing is like, okay, now you have more money going to the partners. You're building their capacity. You're embedding capacity, your staff into their institutions if they need it, and all of that. Then the third thing is like, now you say, okay, I'm not gonna send a proposal to the French government, Swiss government, to whoever, without it being designed with or by the partners. And the partner will have to see the final proposal that's submitted. So they have visibility on your project proposal, on your budget, how much you get, how much they get. It's all very transparently done. And you're sharing your overheads equally and all of that. So that's really hard because right now the instinct is something happens, you get an opportunity for Swiss funding, you write your project proposal in Switzerland, and then you go and take it to your partner in Kenya or Ethiopia or Somalia and say, hey, can you implement this project? Rather than the other way around. And so that has to stop. And so those, I think, are the three major basic ways that INGOs can change.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much. You touched upon it a little bit, but indeed, a lot of the sector is a bit stuck in a rigid way of carrying out funding and short-term, project-based intervention that limit a lot of this. So I was wondering, what are the biggest barriers preventing Global South organizations from having equal decision-making when it comes to the aid sector in general, whether it's humanitarian or development? What needs to change?
I think the biggest constraint that these organizations have is resources, is money, because you're underfunded. You are constantly on this deficit cycle. You are in this constant survival mode. And you, as a leader of this organization, honestly, don't even think about your future sustainability. How do I help this organization become really resilient and sustainable? As a leader of a local organization, you end up being the logistician, the program manager, the executive director. Sometimes you're in the finance role. You're really having 3, 4, 5 hats at a time. And you don't even have the capacity to take a step back and think strategically and long term for your own institution. That's number one. Number two, the lack of funding also makes you feel like you don't have the power to push back against NGOs or UN agencies. You don't have the power or the ability to be picky, to be selective, to be principled. If you know this is wrong, there's so many times we have accepted funding that we knew was wrong, that we knew it wasn't helpful to the communities, or we knew the terms of and the conditions were really very top down, very almost humiliating and for us, but we accepted it because we didn't have the funding. We didn't feel like we had choices. I want an organization to not feel that way. I wanted them to be in a position where they're financially strong enough that they can say, no, I don't want that kind of funding anymore. And third is that because you don't most funding that comes from NGOs and UN agencies is project-specific funding. It's short-term, 6 months, maximum a year. You don't have the time, you don't have the resources to invest in your own capacity. So you hire a finance person, you barely fund them, you give them a very small salary in comparison to an NGO or UN actor. You hire somebody that they wouldn't even interview, let alone hire. They would never shortlist them. You take a chance, you hire somebody who has very little capacity, quote unquote, according to international standards. And then you develop them, you invest in them, you hire them, and then they work with you a year and a half, your funding ends, and then you have to let them go. Or they end up leaving you for better terms and conditions with an NGO or UN agency. And then you have to start the whole process over again. So this whole narrative about locals not having capacity is, in my opinion, so wrong in so many ways when we are actively, consistently developing the capacity of UN agencies and NGOs. Almost all the staff, local staff of these entities usually start off as staff of a local organization. And we're the ones who take risks in hiring people that you guys would never hire. We take them at a very junior, basic level, and we develop them, we invest in them, and they end up leaving us. So that's a third issue. And then the last issue is because of the project nature of the work, we end up getting funding for service delivery of projects and programs. We rarely get funding for advocacy positions, for communications positions, for fundraising positions, marketing positions. So that's why they don't have usually resources to have a really nice website, to have really nice communications material, to have all of this, because you need all of that to raise money. You need all of that to increase your credibility. You need all of that to show up in international forums. You need all of that to do advocacy in your country or to do it internationally. And they usually don't have advocacy staff or policy staff. And so it's hard then to show up in international forums or even local forums and divide it yourself. I mean, I cannot tell you, up to today, I'm both the head of advocacy and the executive director of Adesso. We don't have a full-time dedicated advocacy staff. So going back to that whole thing where as a leader of a local organization, you wear many, many hats almost all the time. And so how do you effectively participate in decision-making forums in spaces that are really important if you don't have the staff and you end up being overstretched? You can't really effectively engage as a local organization. Sometimes you as a local leader might be doing some amazing work on the ground, but your English is not the best. And so you have to now participate in these spaces where English is the language of operation, and you're in Syria or you're in Somalia, and every conversation is happening in English in these countries. And so you're like, you can't effectively engage, but you would love to hire an advocacy person that speaks English that can engage, but you don't have the money for that. So how can you effectively participate if you don't even speak the language that all the business is being conducted in? I mean, just basic things like that we don't even think about. We take it for granted, thinking, oh, of course, English should be the language of operation in Syria or Turkey or Somalia. That makes absolutely no sense. You know, it's like going to a flood response in Spain right now, and all the people responding in that flood response are from Kenya, and they have meetings only in Swahili.
Right.
But that's expected of us, that's normalized, but it's like things that we never expect to be done in your countries are normal for us to accept in our countries.
No, absolutely. It's really hard to imagine in other circumstances, but it makes sense. So all these barriers are definitely known by most of the actors, I would say, in the sector, and we're showing it more and more as an issue. And I think slowly, I hope that most international NGOs, local and national NGOs as well, are working on this issue and trying to increase, the pressure on donors to go towards more flexible funding, to force also a little bit international NGOs or UN agencies to localize or carry out more locally led development activities. And so we're trying to go through that work at Terre des Hommes, but in your opinion, if you were in charge of an international NGOs or perhaps even a UN agency, what would be the practical steps that you would take to try and dismantle this power imbalance in the sector?
I think I would understand every single country we operate in, what the dynamics are, what the issues are, and figure out, do we need to be in this country as a staff? Do we need to have an office? What could we do differently? Every context is different. Sometimes in some context, it is good to have some international presence to help your partners who might be facing some negative repercussions, like in Myanmar, I think, places like that. But those are the outliers. That's not the norm. So I think based on that information gathering exercise and a real just understanding of the context, I would put in place a plan to figure out how to downsize in that country and really make it a partnership-led country program. And to the point where I would fundraise with the partners. I would go to Swiss embassy or the EU for office when I fundraise, and with my partners, so that they get capacity building, they get access to the donor directly, they understand the mechanics of these things. I remember one of the critical things that happened for Adesso is we were receiving Oxfam Novib funding for many, many years, a longtime partner over 10 years. And then sometime in 2007, whatever, I can't remember, or was it earlier, Oxfam Novib team had us go to The Hague, and they introduced us to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we ended up getting funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and direct funding without Oxfam. And then we ended up that in Somalia, the Oxfam Novib program and the Adesso program were one of the only few projects that the Dutch government was supporting in the humanitarian portfolio in Somalia. And then it ended up, they shrank their program even further, and they kept ours, and they stopped funding Oxfam in Somalia. But they were still funding them, of course, in The Hague. They were giving them those big grants at The Hague. But the Somalia portfolio, we ended up getting continuing funding for another year or two, while Oxfam wasn't even funded in the Somalia program. So, like, to me, that's just real integrity of the part of Oxfam Novib. I'm not sure if that was an institution-wide behavior or if that was individuals at Oxfam Novib who had those values and ethos and who did that. I think it was both. I mean, I think Oxfam Novib in those days was very much partnership aligned. They didn't have a lot of offices. They were really more, working through partners or with partners. They had a very strong partnership approach, but you could have been doing the partnership approach for 40 years. There were partners in Somalia that were working with Oxfam for 20 plus years. There's some who are still working with Oxfam Novib for 20 plus years, 30 years, and who have never been introduced to the donor of Oxfam Novib. Whereas those individuals that we were working with had those values and were like, no, you guys have capacity. Let us help you get direct funding so that you don't need us anymore as intermediaries. And so, like, those are the kinds of dramatic shifts that are required. But of course, that comes at a cost to an INGO. It means your funding decreases. So this is what goes back to my original point that I made earlier, where I said, the INGOs need to have a real deep reflection on their future business model. Are you going to, because I always say this, the CEOs and the boards really look to INGOs expanding. They don't look at them as success if they contract, if they get smaller. So, what is your ambition as an organization? Is it to grow and double and triple your income over the next 10 years? Or are you going to really think about how you are more partnership led? And if it means the consequence of that is becoming smaller, then so be it. So that's the risk that many INGOs are not willing to give up. Nobody really wants their funding to decrease. Everybody wants their funding to increase.
Yeah, it's an issue that unfortunately remains in the sector, and that's quite contradictory with certain objectives that international NGOs set for themselves when it comes to locally led development or localization. And it is, still very much an issue that's internally discussed in many of the Western-led international NGOs that we see. One underlying question that relates to that also is, so we work in the sector a lot with Western international donors that have an influence or a certain power over the aid activities that we carry out. And so in the scope of a more localized, or in scope of like Global South organization, if they rely on funding from large international donors, how can they protect their autonomy? How can they protect their voice, to remain independent, to remain community-led, and to serve the communities they're from? Because there's a challenge that is here, a certain dichotomy between large international Western donors and the independence and the autonomy, the voice of Global South actors.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I suspect that, I know that that's the same problem that INGOs have. How independent is an American NGO when 80-90% of its funding comes from USAID?
Exactly.
How independent is it when a UK NGO has, 70-80% of its funding coming from FCDO? So I would actually throw the question back at you all. I would say that there is more chances of lack of independence and sovereignty in your thinking as a global north or an INGO. But when we as Adesso were getting USAID funding or EU funding, I don't think I ever felt that our voice was restricted in calling these donors out. There were times where we were kind of quote unquote blacklisted because we were too controversial about talking about racism in the sector, way before George Floyd and BLM. Now we're in a different space, but the way the things were in 2017, 18, even 19, right? A year before all of that. So, but I honestly didn't care. And I didn't feel like my speech was restricted. And I don't think that our advocacy was really that much restricted at the country level. I feel like, and I don't feel like my identity as a Somali NGO was also in question. I think, whereas I believe that it's much harder being a British NGO or US NGO and being from the same country as your donor, I think that is more restrictive than being a Somali NGO that gets money from USAID or other donors. I think one way to resolve this for both the Global North NGOs and the Global South organizations is that we become more financially independent. We figure out how to, as Adesso, we're trying to actively figure out how we raise money ourselves or generate money ourselves, revenue ourselves through various businesses, so that we eventually have our own endowment and our own source of income, and we're not dependent. And we can say, hey, because of Gaza, we don't want to take your money as US government, or because of this, we don't want to take your money as UK government, or because of that, we don't want to take your money as a foundation. So I think having that independence is extremely important. And it kind of shocks me that, seeing Global North NGOs, I hate calling them INGOs. I really don't like that term because it assumes that only Global North are international and we
Right.
are always local. But Global North NGOs are, after some of them being as old as 70 years, 60 years, 50 years, that they only have like a reserve, but they don't have a significant endowment, knowing that you guys have gotten unrestricted funding from your government donors through these partnership agreements for the past, 20, 30 years. The US NGOs get a very, very nice NICRA rate, indirect cost rate. So I'm just surprised that they haven't engaged in mechanisms to not just have a reserve, but have a significant endowment for their institutions. It surprises me, honestly. But I also know that some of them are also, trying to think about having an enterprises, private sector arm of those institutions. I think Plan has something, Mercy Corps has something, CARE in Canada has something, but it's not consistent and it's not very significant. So that's what I would be advocating for, is how do we become financially sovereign?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Very interesting. And perhaps, in a few words, to wrap up this exchange, what changes do you hope to see in the next 5 to 10 years on, locally led development and the role of global South actors in this aid architecture that we're in?
I would love to see more global South governments having a more firmer, principled position on the international aid actors in their countries, similar to what Indonesia did in the 2019 tsunami, where they basically said, if you want to work in Indonesia, these are our conditions. You have to work through the government, or you have to work only through Indonesian NGOs. I would like to see more global South governments taking these very strong, principled positions. I like the idea of Philippines under Duterte saying that they're not going to declare any more was it level 3 or level 5 emergencies, saying that we as a government have the capacity to respond. We're not going to do that anymore, where you just come in and once we declare an emergency of that nature, the UN system takes over and the international system comes with their clusters and everything and marginalizes the governments. I would love to see more African countries doing that and more, MENA countries doing that. I think Asia and Latin America are a little more advanced than us, and they're taking a much more stronger position as governments. So I would love to see that. I would love to see stronger government actions on the system and drawing some red lines. And then I think what second thing that would be really amazing to see is if we have like things like the Pledge for Change are no longer needed. Like INGOs have integrated the pledge commitments as part of their entire system. And you don't need an outside secretariat to say to you, hey, TDH or IRC or Mercy Corps, you're doing this not so well and this not so well. I would love to see that it's an essential part of their DNA to behave differently in everything that they do. It's in all of their policies and procedures. It's in how the board works, how the metrics that the CEO of the organization is judged against includes some of those pledge metrics about partnerships and what are the partners saying about the quality of the relationships, rather than how much money are you bringing into the organization. I would love to see it go from at the top level all the way down. I would love to see more local organizations being very strong, more united at the country level, saying, because of their unity, saying, no, we won't work with you under these terms and conditions. Unless you do X, Y, and Z, we're not going to work with you. And it makes it more and more difficult for the NGOs and the UN agencies to find really good, strong, credible partners, because all the strong, credible partners don't want to work with them because they're not changing their behavior, forcing the system to have to react. I would love to see that we also take a lot of power into our own hands instead of just complaining. So yeah, so the pledge for change by 2030 should not exist because we have been successful in these ways that I've just described. And that's why it's a 2030 commitment. I don't believe in creating institutions that exist forever. So from the beginning, we said by 2030, we hope that the pledge for change can sunset, can close, and that the NGOs have integrated all these commitments into their way of being, into their DNA as an institution. So that's what I would love to see in the next 5 years or so.
Let's hope for that. Thank you very much, Degan Ali, for coming to the podcast today and your insight on these matters. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Martin.
I'm Annie Kövas, and you've been listening to a LocalLink Hub podcast. Today our host was Martin Gallard, Localization and Partnership Manager at Terre des Hommes. We had help from Judith Németh-Almási. Thanks to all of you for listening, and thank you, Degan Ali, for taking the time and sharing your really interesting views on localization. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to learn more about Terre des Hommes initiative, please visit our website at locallink.charthub.org. If you have any comments on the episode or just want to share your thoughts, contact us via social media on Facebook or LinkedIn, or email us on locallink@charthub.org. Thanks for joining. See you on our next episode.